was supposed to be the perfect honeymoon. Sarah and Mark had been married just 3 days, and the excitement of their new life together was still fresh as they drove toward a secluded cabin in the mountains. They'd rented it online, eager to escape the city and enjoy some peace and quiet. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the twisting mountain road bathed in moonlight. The GPS claimed they were only a few miles from the cabin, but as they rounded yet another bend, Sarah glanced at the device with a frown. "It says we should have been there by now," she said, her voice tinged with unease. Mark chuckled, keeping his hands steady on the wheel. "Maybe it's one of those places that doesn't show up quite right on GPS. We'll get there soon. Don't worry." The road was eerily empty, lined with thick trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Sarah glanced out the window, her stomach twisting. Something about the darkness felt too deep, too oppressive. "Did you see that?" she asked suddenly. Mark glanced at her. "See what?" "I thought I saw someone standing by the road," she said, her voice shaky. "Back there by the trees." Mark shook his head. "It's late. Probably just your eyes playing tricks on you." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching them. The car began to slow. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, sitting up straight. Mark frowned. "I don't know. The engine just cut out." He pulled the car to the side of the road and tried the ignition. The engine sputtered but refused to start. "Great," he muttered, pulling out his phone. "Let me call the cabin manager." Sarah glanced nervously out the window again. The trees loomed closer here, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. "Hurry," she whispered. Mark groaned. "No service." "Of course," Sarah muttered, gripping the edge of her seat. "What do we do now?" Mark looked at her, trying to keep his voice calm. "We'll walk. The cabin should be close by." Sarah hesitated, glancing at the dark road ahead. "Walk? What if we're not as close as we think?" "Do you want to stay here all night?" Mark asked gently. Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. "Fine, let's go." They grabbed their bags from the trunk and set off down the road. The night was unnervingly quiet, with no sound except the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. As they walked, Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Mark," she whispered, "I feel like someone's following us." Mark stopped and looked behind them. The road was empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. "There's no one there," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. They continued walking, the tension between them growing. Sarah clung to Mark's arm, her eyes darting to every shadow that seemed to move in the corner of her vision. Then they heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like footsteps on gravel. Mark stopped again, turning sharply. "Who's there?" he called, his voice firm. The road was still empty. "Mark, let's just keep going," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, and they picked up their pace. But the footsteps followed, growing louder. Mark turned again, frustration mixing with fear. "I said, who's there?" This time, they saw it. A figure stood in the distance, just barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and completely still. "Maybe it's someone from the cabins," Sarah said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "Then why aren't they saying anything?" Mark replied, his own fear evident. The figure suddenly began to move, not walking, gliding as if its feet never touched the ground. Sarah's grip on Mark's arm tightened. "We need to run," she said. Without another word, they turned and bolted down the road. Their bags thudded against their sides, and their breaths came in ragged gasps. The footsteps, or whatever they were, grew louder, faster. "Mark, it's getting closer!" Sarah cried. Mark looked over his shoulder and nearly stumbled. The figure was only feet away now. Its face was pale, featureless except for two hollow black eyes that seemed to devour the darkness around them. "Get off the road!" he shouted, pulling Sarah toward the trees. They crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The air felt colder here, heavier. Finally, they stopped, hiding behind a large tree. Mark pressed a finger to his lips, signaling Sarah to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Sarah tried to calm herself, but the oppressive darkness seemed to press down on her chest. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. "Sarah." Her eyes widened and she looked at Mark. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Sarah, Mark." It knew their names. Sarah's grip on Mark's hand tightened. What do we do? Mark shook his head, his voice barely audible. I don't know. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, coming from all directions. You shouldn't have come here. This is our road now. Stay with us. A shadow moved behind them. Sarah turned just in time to see the figure's hollow eyes staring at her through the darkness. She screamed, grabbing Mark's arm and pulling him away. They ran again, crashing through the forest until they burst onto another road. This one was different. Older, with cracked asphalt and no streetlights. It stretched endlessly in both directions, and the air was thick with fog. Where are we? Sarah gasped, looking around in panic. Mark shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. This wasn't on the map. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the fog. This way. Don't leave. You're ours now. Through the fog, they saw lights, faint and flickering. A car, parked on the side of the road. Our car! Sarah cried. They ran toward it, hope surging in their chests. But as they got closer, their hope turned to horror. The car was empty, its doors hanging open. And inside, written in long, jagged letters on the fogged-up windshield, were 3 words, "You'll never leave." Before they could react, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the figure stepped out of the fog, its hollow eyes locking onto them. The last thing Sarah and Mark saw was its outstretched hand reaching for them before the world went black. The next morning, the car was found abandoned on the side of the road. The engine worked perfectly, but Sarah and Mark were nowhere to be seen. Locals say you can still hear their voices on the empty road, calling for help. Help. But if you listen too closely, you might never leave either.